So I did a review of a game called Empire Shall Fall. And Empire Shall Fall is, I was nice in the review. I did not call it a knockoff. It's kind of a knockoff of Nintendo Wars. It has that Advance Wars look. It has the same graphical style. It has the same level design kind of principles. It has the same core mechanics, unit interactions, commander abilities, narrative style. So my review, which was pretty straightforward, was just me saying, here are all the points of similarities. There are some little differences, but still, if you like Advance Wars, if you like the Nintendo Wars game, you'll probably like Empire Shall Fall because they're pretty much the same thing. I got an interesting comment in response to that, not the one from the guy who accused me of defaming people who like TRPGs. That one was special. That's one of my favorite, hostile comments I've received thus far. But from another person who said that ultimately he doesn't care if it's a knockoff because Nintendo games are getting so expensive that if he can find an alternative that is half the price, he's going to go for it. And that right there is the competitive advantage that every indie developer has, which is that you can price your games less than the big dogs can. It's kind of an example of the advantage of backwardness. They've always had this ability to price the games cheaper than larger companies, but it's only recently this has become a really significant advantage. Obviously, there's a lot of belly aching, there's a lot of anger over price increases in video games, and because of that, some people are talking about looking for cheaper alternatives. I don't think Nintendo fans will, although, I don't know, maybe if the, Nintendo Wars, I don't think they're going to be looking for an alternative to Donkey Kong or whatever. But we are in a point where people are looking to save money, where people are not pleased with the fact that games are getting more expensive at a time when they're trying to save money. And so this gives these smaller developers a chance to kind of swoop in and steal the thunder from larger developers. And this used to be, honestly, a surprisingly trivial advantage, just because, again, things like IPs matter so much to people and flashy games matter to people. And it didn't really seem like to the typical consumer that an indie game in a similar category to a AAA game was really an adequate substitute. As I've always said, the little guy succeeds by hitting underserved markets. You find places where the AAA developers don't go, and you camp there. And that's kind of how you succeed. Fighting them on their own turf generally does not end well. But then Rematch came out. Boy, howdy, do we need to talk about Rematch right now, because this is kind of turning my brain inside out how well this one is doing. Now, some of you might not be familiar with this one, which is funny because it's selling really well. Estimated sales are between 1.2 and 1.4 million copies. I saw a video about this that referred to it as the best game you've never heard of. And I'm thinking, dude, it's knocking the shit out of Deltarune. Let's not talk like you found something obscure here. If you haven't heard of it, it's probably because it's a soccer game. And much like me, if you don't give a shit about sports, you probably don't care about Rematch. But it is already, and this only came out a few weeks ago, it is selling so fast and it is selling so well. It's beginning to make me at least rethink some of the assumptions I had about these small developers being able to compete with the bigger developers. So a little bit of background about this one. Rematch was developed by a company called Slowclap. You may have heard of them because this is not their first rodeo. It's, I believe, the third game they've done. The last one they did was Sifu. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Sifu. It was very popular, apparently did especially well on the consoles, and it was a bit of a critic's darling. So Slowclap, they've been around, but Sifu was another one of those games that did well for an indie, but Rematch is kind of breaking out of that, again with over 1 million sales. Now, this is not the first time indie developers have tackled sports games. It's a rare thing for them to go after for several reasons. I think one, a lot of these are passion projects, and most people, their passions probably don't run towards making sports games, but even if that was what you wanted to do, it is so hard to imagine competing, because in this case, you're competing with EA Sports. And EA Sports is one of the biggest video game franchises on Earth. Like, it's an area where you just don't win. Not to mention, sports games generally don't do that well on PC. It's very much a console kind of thing. Nevertheless, a few years ago, we had Tape to Tape, which was an indie hockey game that did quite well. It sold, estimates are between 100 and 200,000 copies, so that's really good. So that at least opened up the possibility for there to be a niche for small developers to do more niche sports-related games. But to me, there is a big difference between one of these games selling 100,000 copies, which is excellent news for the developer, and one of these games selling 1 million copies, which is the point where you begin to wonder, are these guys actually competitive with EA? On that last point, I should compare this straight across to EA Sports FC 25, all right, which has been out for a while, so it may not be a direct comparison, but I think it's worth mentioning. EA Sports FC 25 estimates for sales on Steam is around 2.5 million copies versus 1.2 for Rematch. The peak, or the typical 24-hour peak player count for FC 25 is 75 to 85,000 people. That's versus about 40,000 people for Rematch. So what you look again and again, you are seeing that Rematch, this little game that only came out a few weeks ago, this little indie developed title that is half the price of FC 25, is consistently doing about half as well as FC 25. So lower, significantly lower, yet of comparable size. That's a big deal. I don't feel like I need to tell you why that's a big deal. And this is just the start of it, because this is not the only small developed game, sports game coming out. There's another soccer game coming out later this year. It's going to be free to play. So there are other people who seem to have decided that they can make a run for EA Sports. And you know what? Having seen these numbers, one of them could pull it off. I think part of what's helping here is I mentioned earlier that an issue that the small developers always have to overcome is IP recognition and how much that matters to people. Well, EA Sports is, of course, one of the more famous, one of the more profitable brands in video games, but I don't know if people care about EA Sports. I don't know if people care about the FC, the FIFA brand so much. They just want to play a soccer game. The only reason that EA is so big is because these days they're kind of the only game in town. It's not like back in the 90s when you had competing sports franchises. These days, if you want to play a sports game with your online friends, you kind of have to do it through EA. And what I am wondering is if you start to see more competitive titles that are competitively priced, if that is going to start to cut into EA's dominance, at least on PC, just a little bit. Really, what I would need to see to make a call like this is how well Rematch is doing on the consoles. And they do seem to be making this multi-platform push. They're trying to get esports leagues interested in this. And so this is something they're taking really seriously. And it does kind of feel like it's Kepler Interactive who's publishing it, that they really are making a run to kind of make this the first like really, really big deal indie sports game. And that's a really huge deal. If this works, if they are able to even come within striking distance of an EA Sports title, then that is massive. Because what that suggests is that this competitive advantage of cheapness is for real, for one. Kind of already know that, but also that it's big enough to let them challenge existing IPs, to let them challenge AAA companies in spaces where they have traditionally been dominant. And that's massive. Interestingly enough, I read a report from Newzoo this week that was kind of on a related topic relating to pricing. Not directly, it was actually about co-op games. Now, I've talked about co-op and how important it's kind of becoming for small developers. I said it was one of the big trends with these small games. You're seeing more and more and more of them having co-op elements. To recap, the big advantage of co-op is that these days, most people don't do a lot of matchmaking with co-op like they do in multiplayer games more generally. These tend to be games that you want to play with people you know in real life. So if you have, say, a 4-player co-op game, then to play it yourself, you have to get 3 friends, which means that for every sale you make, just to the individual who's discovered this game, it converts into 4 sales. Now, this is something that's worked out very well for Chained Together last year and Repo this year. But what the Newzoo report suggests is that a big part of this is because both of these games are very cheap. Pricing is always a big concern with small developers. The price of indie games has actually been creeping up, but it is still very low compared to the typical AAA or even AA game. I read years ago, they kind of put together these estimates on sort of where people start to have doubts, like sort of what is the most expensive game that people are willing to just take a risk on. and it's somewhere between $20 and $30. I don't remember exactly where it is. But that's why when you look around, you do tend to see your kind of typical indie is $20 and down, because that's the limit where people are still willing to, take a shot on something that they're not familiar with, from a studio they've never heard of, from a game that kind of looks interesting, but they don't know how it's going to play. They will take a risk on that if it is $20 and down. Once you hit $30, people get a little more reticent. At that point, they have certain expectations of quality that many indie developers simply cannot match. And that is why it's a lot harder to sell games at that point unless you have really strong production values or you're kind of a known quantity. You're maybe one of the more successful, one of the better known and better respected studios. Well, per Newzoo, the number for these co-op games actually might be lower than that. They're suggesting the cutoff point's about $15. Now, the reason for this, I imagine, is because a lot of the people playing these are what I called in the last video, non-traditional gamers. So people who probably do not play video games on a regular basis. It's just something they jump into and out of with their friends. One point of evidence in favor of that is that Repo actually doesn't have much average playtime. Most people are only playing it about 6 hours a month, which suggests that this is something people do with their friends when it's like a lazy Saturday afternoon. This is not necessarily your really serious core demographic. A lot of these are, they'll be discovered by one of the people who's really tracking the indie space, but then they're talking their non-video game playing friends into giving it a shot. And if you're making that pitch, it helps if it's only $10. If it's more than that, if it's $30 or let alone $60, if it's AAA price, then it gets a lot harder to convince people. And at that point, you lose the advantage. Because the issue with this is if you are playing co-op games exclusively with people you know in real life, you need to have enough people in real life necessary to fill out that roster so you can play it. Otherwise, you're not going to buy it. Put simply, if you're looking at a 4-player co-op game, you need to find 3 friends to play it. If you can't find 3 people, then you're not going to buy it yourself. And in that case, 1 sale converted into 0. So this is another area where that competitive advantage really gives small developers a chance to get ahead where other people are going to fall behind, where even the AAA guys are going to fall behind. Price is going to matter over the next couple of years. I do have to wonder if price is going to end up mattering more than things like production values, and we could end up seeing like the lack of investment money in this space kind of turning into another advantage of backwardness type of thing. But that is just a possibility. There are a lot of directions this can go, but I thought just for a change, some of you might like to hear me say something positive and optimistic about the indie space. So what are your thoughts? Do you agree with me on this? Do you think things are going upwards or downwards? Hit me up, leave a comment.